The missiles were in the air. Armageddon had begun. Sanislav Petrov's face was lit up by the red emergency glow coming from his computer monitor. His ears rang from the sirens that echoed through the command center. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't a drill. The Soviet Union was under attack. The computer detected one launch, then another, then 3 more. 5 Minutemen nuclear missiles were on their way from the US to the Soviet Union. Or were they? Something seemed off. Why only 5? Stanislav had a decision to make, a decision that could have destroyed the world. Ryan v. Psyops. As far as Stanislav knew, there was no reason why the US wouldn't start a nuclear war. In fact, he and his bosses were expecting it. It was 1983, and America and the Soviet Union had been ramping up tensions for a few years. When President Reagan took office in 1981, he tossed aside the more peaceful rhetoric of his predecessor, Jimmy Carter. He took a tougher stance on the Soviets, calling them the focus of evil in the world. In response, Soviet leaders like Secretary General Yuri Andropov fired back, calling him a warmonger and even comparing him to Adolf Hitler. One of the issues was that the people running the Soviet Union were old enough to remember Operation Barbarossa. That's when, in July 1941, the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union seemingly out of nowhere. It wasn't out of nowhere. There were warnings and intel suggesting Hitler was up to something, but the Soviets ignored it. It led to the worst military disaster in Russia's history and tens of millions of lost lives. It left a lasting mark on the Russian psyche. They weren't about to let it happen again. Andropov was convinced that the US was planning a surprise attack, so he got his country ready for war. The Soviets began Operation Ryan, which stands for Raketno-Yadерное нападение, meaning nuclear missile attack. This was a signal for their spies around the globe to keep an eye on NATO and US plans for a nuclear strike, as well as the weapons they'd use. Ryan was likely a reaction to a series of US PSYOPs, or psychological warfare operations, that started right after Reagan took office. They did things like fly American bombers right up to the edges of Soviet airspace, close enough for radars to detect them, and then suddenly pull back. Then they'd come back again. They also sent warships into areas that were tough for Soviet radar to track. In August 1981, the USS Eisenhower led an 81-ship fleet through the only Atlantic sea route to the Soviet Union without being detected at all. They used radar jamming, kept radio silence, and sent out fake radar signals, doing everything they could to stay invisible, then carried out simulated attacks on major Russian assets. Once they were done, 4 of those ships headed out to the Barents Sea, just off of Murmansk, and hung out there for 9 days. The Soviets quickly caught wind that NATO ships had slipped past their defenses thanks to their spy network. It terrified them, which was the idea. As the years rolled on, the US got more daring. In April 1983, they sent a fleet of 40 ships and 300 aircraft toward the Soviets' key submarine base on Sakhalin Island in the Kamchatka Peninsula. That same month, the US Air Force flew over Soviet bases pretending to conduct bombing raids and got no response. They were trying to provoke the Russians to see how they'd react, but it only made the Soviets more paranoid. Star Wars. Adding to the tension was the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars. The plan was to create a network of ground and satellite-based laser weapons that could stop missiles from hitting targets in the USA. If it worked, the whole idea of mutual assured destruction would be a thing of the past. The US could launch a nuclear strike without worrying about retaliation. After finding out about Star Wars, Andropov was furious. He claimed Reagan was inventing new plans on how to unleash a nuclear war in the best way, with the hope of winning it. He made it known that he was aware of the size and capabilities of the US nuclear arsenal and wanted to know the world that his was larger. He said, "The Soviet Union will never be caught defenseless by any threat. Engaging in this is not just irresponsible, it is insane. Washington's actions are putting the entire world in jeopardy." One of the Soviet Union's most powerful leaders was preparing his country for nuclear war. Then, things got worse. On September 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 took off from Anchorage in Alaska, heading to Seoul in South Korea. On board were 3 pilots who had been taking turns on a 5-day trip that messed with their body rhythms. Even though they were following the regulations, they were still pretty tired. To make things worse, KAL 007 was set to take off at 4 a.m. Alaska time and land 8 hours later at 6 a.m. Seoul time. They'd be flying for 8 hours in total darkness after having hardly slept for days. But Captain Chun had flown this route 80 times. He knew where he was going. They were supposed to take a path that avoided Soviet airspace, heading down the Bering Strait before turning west over Japan. It wasn't an easy route. They spent almost no time near land, so they had to rely on airspeed, wind, heading, and time to figure out where they were. This process is called dead reckoning. But something went wrong. Maybe it was fatigue, the tricky navigation, or a mistake made with the autopilot, but somehow KAL 007 ended up in Soviet airspace, heading toward the submarine base at Sakhalin Island, the same base that PSYOPs had been messing with for the past 2 years. Andropov had tightened things up since the PSYOPs. Now any plane that crossed into Soviet airspace was to be intercepted. A fighter was launched, and KAL 007 was intercepted and shot down, taking the lives of all 269 people on board. The US government labeled it deliberate mass murder. Reagan called it an act of barbarism, born out of a society which wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life, and seeks constantly to expand and dominate other nations. The Soviets blamed the US for sending spy planes along that route, saying they didn't know it was a civilian aircraft. By the end of September, the Cold War was more tense than it had been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then, on September 26th, in a small nuclear monitoring station called Serpukhov 15, about 80 miles south of Moscow, the sirens went off. Petrov's elbow. Stanislav Petrov was in charge, but he wasn't meant to be. The duty officer couldn't make it, so Stanislav had agreed to cover the shift. But he was tired. He had spent all day doing his main job of looking after the computer, and like most nights, nothing was happening. Just some flickering switches and an empty monitor screen. He was struggling to keep his eyes open. That was until the sirens went off. They jolted him awake. Stanislav leaned into the monitor, now glowing red with warning lights reading launch. A missile had been fired from a base in North Dakota. Then, to his horror, he watched as 4 more missiles launched from the same base. It seemed like all the tension of the past few years had led to this moment. Something had given, and America had decided to strike first. He double-checked the system's reliability. The computer was convinced that these launches really were a preemptive strike. He had 20 minutes to decide the fate of the world. All Stanislav had to do was call his superiors to let them know, and then Armageddon would begin. But something held him back. As Stanislav put it, he felt like he was sitting in a hot frying pan. Despite the rising heat, a few things stopped him from jumping into the fire. One was his background. Everyone else in the bunker was a professional soldier. They followed the rules automatically. Lieutenant Stanislav Petrov came from a tough home where his fighter pilot dad would often discipline him with his fists. Even though he had a creative flair, he was forced to join the Soviet Air Force as a teenager. Instead of training him to be a pilot like his father, they spotted his talent and found a way to use it, sending him to study engineering at a Soviet Air Force technical college. After graduating in 1972, he got to work on the Soviet Air Defense's new computerized early warning system, helping shape the technology and design the bunker he was in. Stanislav, more than maybe anyone else in the room, knew the system had flaws. The Oko satellites that spotted launches had been wrong before, if not as catastrophically. The launch could just be the sun reflecting off of something. But the computer insisted with high certainty that an attack had started. Nuclear annihilation was on the way. Stanislav couldn't get past the number of missiles that were launched. Why 5? He couldn't think of just 5 strategic targets that would make sense, and he was sure NATO and the US knew that too. They had to know. He decided to check the over-the-horizon radar system to see if it had picked up anything. It hadn't. To Stanislav, everything felt too quick, and the computer seemed too confident. The frying pan just kept getting hotter. Although his background was different to the other soldiers in the bunker, all that training in the Soviet Air Force had one goal: to teach men to do as they're told without question. He wasn't supposed to spend time thinking. He was supposed to let his superiors know and leave the next step up to them. He figured the other monitoring systems would have got the same intel, and being good soldiers, they'd be following the rules and alerting their commanders. If he contacted bosses, no one would have said anything against it, and the Soviet nuclear arsenal could be unleashed, but Stanislav had a funny feeling in his gut. So, with a calm demeanor that didn't match the panic inside of him, the last man standing between more years of awkward peace and an all-out nuclear war reached forward, took the phone out of its cradle, called his superiors, and told them it was a false alarm. He figured that if he was wrong, there'd be no one left to discipline him anyway. Then he just sat and waited for 20 minutes to pass. Any second now, the missiles would come raining down. The Soviets would launch over 35,000 nuclear warheads. The US would fire back more than 23,000. In less than 15 minutes, everyone or everything everywhere would be gone. Billions would die in flames, or in an instant. The rest would starve in the nuclear winter that followed. The minutes dragged on like hours, but nothing happened. No missile strikes reported, no retaliation ordered. Armageddon was postponed. BBC Russia is reported to have said if the Russian Air Force is an arm prepared to raise a fist, Petrov is the elbow. The 5 missiles that the system thought were nuclear launches turned out just to be sunlight bouncing off of clouds. The sun was at the perfect height, and the satellite happened to be watching from just the right angle. At first, Stanislav tried to keep everything under wraps, but keeping secrets in the Soviet Union was tough. Once they figured out what had happened, he got some praised, but that quickly turned into a slap on the wrist for not logging the incident. They didn't punish him too obviously, since they couldn't admit their early warning system had a bug, but he was passed over for any promotions and moved to a less important post. The Soviets were much better at keeping secrets themselves, so the rest of the world only found out how close it came to ending after the Soviet Union fell apart in 1992. Eventually, he got some recognition. He was honored by the United Nations in 2006, won a German Media Award in 2011, and the Dresden Peace Prize in 2013. He passed away in 2017. Today, some people celebrate September 26th as Petrov Day, with the reminder, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, take a minute to not destroy the world. Thanks for watching.